Good morning, everybody from India, from the Nilgiris, and good evening to you all in the US and Ithaca and wherever you are. We are today very excited to bring you the first webinar from the Nilgiris Foundation. The Nilgiris Foundation is a nonprofit that has been formed in San Francisco about 2 years back to help and empower and work with Keystone Foundation and other like-minded organizations and individuals across the US and across the globe. So we see this as a bridge between US and India to look at different models of development, look at different models of education and empowerment, different models of resilience and solidarity. Today we'll speak through the eyes of Indigenous communities who are sitting with me, and Neema, my counterpart, who will also speak on the NFLC. The topic is the pandemic's impact on the Indigenous communities. The pandemic, as we know, 2020, 2021, and is still going on. It's completely taken everybody by surprise and by storm. How do Indigenous communities living in the Nilgiri Hills, how have they coped? What has been their strategy? What has been their thinking? And how, as NFLC alums, they have looked at these things. The NFLC is the Nilgiris Field Learning Centre. So I'll start by introducing each one of them, and then I'll hand it over to Neema to introduce our Cornell alums from there. So Jayanti, to my extreme right, she is an Irula leader, one of the first NFLC persons. She handles the community radio. She looks at something called Sime Suddhi, which is boundary news about the community every month. And she will speak from an Irula perspective, how they are looking at all that, at the pandemic. Then we have Lakshmi, who is the translator. She has joined the community well-being team. She has a specialization on mental health, and she has been working hands-on with the community, looking at distribution of nutrition kits. We have Montesh from the Toda community, the pastoral community, also an NFLC alum. He will talk to us from the Toda perspective, which is very different as they live also at a higher and a different altitude. To my left is Vichitra, also from the Irula community, and we will hear from her how they have managed the COVID and what are their thoughts going forward. Neema, I pass it on to you to introduce the other two, please.
Okay, thank you, Pratim. Thank you for joining us. And let me just change and get to the next slide. As Pratim said, we really, we wanted to bring together a group of young people from the Nilgiris Field, who've all been alums of the Nilgiris Field Learning Centre. And it's a program that Pratim had, dreamt about. And then a group of us, including my colleague Andrew Wilford, who's on the call with us, we operationalized and created, made real. And we've been running this now for about a decade, and we've had many students go through it, and you're going to be hearing from 5 of them today. So I can talk about the NFLC till the cows come home. That's not what you're all interested in, but I did think that I would share a small. Oh, and there's an image. The year that Cole, Laura, and Jayanti, who were our first batch, right? They were making the presentation to the community of the projects that they had worked on together. And so there's, so I found this wonderful image, and I wanted to share it with them, and I didn't show it to them so they would also have that little bit of excitement when they saw it. And so I won't talk much about the program. That first batch, which Cole, Jayanti, and Laura were a part of, had put together a little video for us. And so I thought I would share it with all of you. So it's not done yet. So I just wanted to give you a sense of what the program was like. I'm sorry, and with that, I'm going to, and then I have two of our Cornell alums, Cole Norgarden and Laura Povis, with us today. And Cole graduated from the Urban and Regional Studies program at Cornell and now works in affordable housing with the Philadelphia Housing Authority, while Laura, graduated from Cornell, went back to work in human development, went back to India and worked for a year in Mumbai, and then did her master's in public health, and is now working on maternal and infant nutrition in DC. And so they're going to be addressing this question of resilience and all of it, and solidarity and what they did during this pandemic a little later. But I'm going to turn this back now to our friends in Mandare with Pratim. So Pratim, all yours.
Thanks a lot, Neema. Can we just go to the next slide where we look at each person before I give them the floor? Yeah, that's Jayanti with the communities in the village. Jayanti, would you speak and share about your experiences, please?
Sure, sir. Good morning, all. இந்த தொடக்க காலத்துல மக்கள் அவங்களுடைய உணவு மேல ரொம்ப நம்பிக்கை வச்சிருந்தாங்க. முக்கியமா அவங்களுடைய வன அந்த எடுத்துக்கிறதால அவங்களுக்கு கோவிடால பாதிப்பு வராது அப்படின்னு பெரிய நம்பிக்கை இருந்தது.
In the beginning of the pandemic, people placed immense belief on the traditional foods, and this made them to be
போகாம கிராமங்களே இருந்ததால அந்த அவங்களுடைய கிராமங்களை சுத்தி இருக்கிற வனப்பகுதியில இருக்கிற உணவுப் பொருள், அவங்களுடைய மருந்து பொருட்கள் கூட அவங்க சேகரிச்சு பயன்படுத்த ஆரம்பிச்சாங்க.
People started collecting wild foods and even medicine plants from the forest, and they started using that a lot.
மக்கள் வேலைக்கு போகாம அந்த கிராமங்கள்லயே இருந்ததால ஒரு சில மக்கள் வந்து வெளியில வேலைக்கு போயிருந்தாங்க. அவங்க திரும்பி அவங்களுடைய கிராமங்களுக்கு வந்துட்டாங்க இந்த கோவிட் சிச்சுவேஷனால. அதனால அவங்களுடைய வாழ்வாதாரம் ரொம்பவே பாதிப்புக்குள்ளாச்சு.
People who had moved out of the villages for employment had to move back to the villages because of the lockdown, and this impacted their livelihood.
அந்த சமயத்துல கீஸ்டோன் ஃபவுண்டேஷன்ல இருந்து ஒரு ஏபிபி அப்படின்னு சொல்லிட்டு ஒரு ப்ராஜெக்ட், அது மூலமா மக்களுக்கு பாரம்பரிய விதைகள், அதுக்கப்புறம் லேண்ட் கிளீன் பண்றதுக்காக கொஞ்சம் சப்போர்ட் கொடுத்திருந்தாங்க. அது மூலமா அவங்க அந்த பாரம்பரிய விவசாயத்துக்குள்ளார போக ஆரம்பிச்சாங்க.
During this period, organizations like Keystone Foundation offered seed support for farmers who went back to practices, and they also gave them support for
இந்த அக்ரிகல்ச்சர் பிராக்டிஸ் வந்து தொடர்ந்து பேண்டமிக் டைம்ல அவங்களுடைய உணவு தேவை
to meet their food needs during this lockdown.
இந்த பேண்டமிக் டைம்ல அவங்களுக்கு உணவு அப்புறம் மருந்து கிடைக்கிறதுல நிறைய சிக்கல் இருந்தது. முக்கியமா பாக்குறோம் அப்படின்னா எபிலப்சி, பிளட் ப்ரெஷர், டயபெட்டிஸ், இந்த மாதிரி முக்கியமான நோய்களுக்கு வந்து மருந்து கிடைக்கிறதுல பெரிய பிரச்சனை இருந்தது. அந்த மாதிரி சமயங்கள்ல கீஸ்டோன் மாதிரி இருக்கிற ஆர்கனைசேஷன்ஸ், கவர்மெண்ட், இந்த மாதிரி மக்கள் வந்து நிறைய சப்போர்ட் கொடுத்தாங்க. அது மூலமா அவங்க வெளியில வர ஆரம்பிச்சாங்க.
People faced a lot of challenges in accessing food and their medicinal needs to be met, especially conditions like epilepsy, blood pressure, diabetes. They could not access medicines for these. And during this time, organizations like Keystone and the government also offered support, which helped the people a lot.
மக்கள் அந்த கிராமங்களிலே இருக்கும்போது ஒண்ணு அவங்களுக்கு வாழ்வாதாரம் சம்பந்தமான எந்த வேலையுமே இல்லை, அதே மாதிரி ஃபுட் கிடைக்கல, மெடிசன் கிடைக்கல. அப்படி இருக்கும்போது நிறைய மக்கள் மனநல பாதிப்பு ஆகிறதுக்கு ஆயிட்டு இருந்தாங்க.
During this lockdown, since their livelihood, food and medicines were a big challenge, the mental well-being of the people was affected.
குழந்தைங்க யாருமே ஸ்கூலுக்கு போக முடியல இந்த டைம்ல, எல்லாரும் வீட்டுல தான் இருந்தாங்க. ஆனா ஆன்லைன் மூலமா நிறைய கிளாஸஸ் இருந்தது, இருந்தாலுமே இந்த ரொம்ப இன்டீரியர் பிளேஸ்ல அவங்களுக்கு நெட்வொர்க்கிங் அவ்வளவு கிடைக்காது. ஸோ இதனால அந்த ஆன்லைன் கிளாஸுமே வந்து குழந்தைங்க அட்டென்ட் பண்ண முடியாம அவங்களுடைய படிப்பு ரொம்பவே பாதிப்பாச்சு.
Another major impact was on education. Even though there were online classes being made to support classes, in our areas, since there is problem with network, children could not access online classes.
இந்த தடுப்பூசி
and lots of misconceptions around vaccination. People fear that they would die after taking the vaccines, and they might even contact the virus because of the vaccination.
இந்த சமயங்கள்ல சில NGOs லைக் கீஸ்டோன் மாதிரி இருக்கிற NGOs, அதுக்கப்புறம் கவர்மெண்ட்ல இருந்து நிறைய இந்த கோவிட் பத்தின வேக்சினேஷன் பத்தின அவேர்னஸ் நிறைய கொடுக்க ஆரம்பிச்சாங்க. அதுக்கப்புறம் மக்கள் வேக்சின் எடுத்துக்கிறதுக்கு ஆரம்பிச்சிருக்காங்க.
After which organizations like Keystone and the government had a lot of awareness programs on vaccinations and aftermath of vaccinations, which prompted people to go for vaccinations.
இந்த கோவிட் மேல மக்களுக்கு நிறைய மூட நம்பிக்கைகள் இருந்தது. இந்த கோவிட் அப்படின்றது மக்களுடைய கடவுள் நம்ம மேல வச்சிருக்கிற ஒரு கோபம், இல்ல கடவுள் நமக்கு கொடுத்திருக்கிற சாபம், இந்த மாதிரியான நிறைய மூட நம்பிக்கைகள் மக்கள் கிட்ட இருந்தது.
There was superstitious beliefs around COVID, and they believed that their gods had a curse on them, and which was the COVID, and there was even anger that the gods had on them, which caused this pandemic. These were some beliefs that they had around the virus.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jayanti. Let's go to Mantish.
ஃபர்ஸ்ட் வந்து இந்த வைரஸ் வந்து சைனாவில் ஸ்ப்ரெட் ஆகிட்டு இருக்கும்போது இங்கே வந்து நாங்களாம் இது இந்தியாவுக்கு வரும்னு நினைக்கவே இல்லை.
Initially, when we started to see that the virus was being spread in China, we did not believe that it would even come to our country.
அப்புறம் இங்கே வந்து நாங்கள் ரொம்ப பயந்துட்டோம். அது இல்லாமல் அப்புறம் அந்த வைரஸ் இங்கே வந்ததும் நாங்கள் நிறைய எங்கள் கோயிலெல்லாம் ஃபாஸ்டிங் இருந்து வீக்லி ஒன்ஸ் வந்து உலகத்தில் எல்லாத்துக்கும் இந்த வைரஸ் வந்து க்யூர் ஆகணும்னு எல்லாம் வேண்டணும்.
And later when we saw that it got spread in India too, there was a lot of fear among us, and then we resorted to our gods and we started offering prayers as the only way of protecting ourselves from the virus.
ஸோ இந்த லாக்டவுன் டைம்ல வந்து டோலாஸ்க்கு நிறைய லேண்ட் இருந்தாலும் அது வந்து அவுட் சைடர்ஸ்க்கு வந்து லீஸ் கொடுத்துருந்தாங்க. ஆனால் இந்த லாக்டவுன் டைம்ல அவங்களே வந்து எல்லா ஃபார்மிங் பண்ண ஆரம்பிச்சிருக்காங்க.
Todas, we have a lot of land, but it was all leased before. But during this lockdown, we ourselves started doing agriculture in our own lands.
ஃபார்மிங் பண்ணாலும் ஆனால் அந்த லாக்டவுன் டைம்ல வந்து அவங்க மார்க்கெட்டிங் வந்து பெரிய லாஸ் ஆச்சு.
Though we were able to do farming, we could not market our produce, and because of this, we faced a lot of effect. It affected our income.
ஸோ அந்த வெஜிடபிள்ஸ் வந்து எங்கள் பக்கத்தில் இருக்கிற ஊருக்கு எங்களோட வில்லேஜ்க்கு அதுக்கு வந்து டிஸ்ட்ரிபியூட் பண்ணி வச்சது.
Since we could not market it to the outside areas, we started distributing this to the nearby Thoda villages.
இப்போ இந்த லாக்டவுன் டைம் வந்து பெரிய ஒரு டிராபேக் என்னன்னு பார்த்தீங்கன்னா, இப்போ டோடாஸ் வந்து ஃபர்ஸ்ட் யூஸ்வலாக வந்து கொஞ்சம் சின்ன வயசுல மேரேஜ் பண்ணிடுவாங்க. ஆனால் இப்போ ஒரு 5-6 இயர்ஸாக வந்து எல்லாரும் இந்த யங்ஸ்டர்ஸ் வந்து கொஞ்சம் படிக்கிற ஸ்டடீஸ் மேலே கொஞ்சம் இன்ட்ரெஸ்ட் காமிச்சிருக்காங்க.
There is a practice of early marriage among us, and it was not happening before 5 or 6 years because people started going for education.
இப்போ வந்து மறுபடியும் அது அகைன் மறுபடியும் அது கண்டினியூ ஆயிடுச்சு. ஆனால் காலேஜ் இல்லாதனால எல்லாம் இப்போ இந்த லாக்டவுன் டைம்ல வந்து நிறைய பேர் வந்து இந்த ஒரு 21 அந்த ஏஜ்ல வந்து எல்லாம் மேரேஜ் பண்றாங்க, நிறைய பேர் மேரேஜ் பண்றாங்க.
But due to closure of schools, this practice has again increased in our community.
அதே மாதிரி வந்து நிறைய சில்ட்ரன்ஸ் வந்து ஸ்கூல்ல, அதனால ஆனால் அவங்க வந்து கல்ச்சரல் ப்ராக்டிஸ்ல வந்து நிறைய இன்ட்ரெஸ்ட் காமிச்சிருக்காங்க, இன்வால்மெண்ட் கொடுக்குறாங்க. ஆனால் ஸ்கூல் அதனால அந்த சுத்தமாக ஸ்டடீஸ் எல்லாம் சுத்தமாக மறந்து போயிட்டாங்க.
So children have been focusing more on cultural practices. Education, academics has been a major problem.
அப்புறம் வந்து இந்த லாக்டவுன் டைம்ல வந்து இந்த என்ஜிஓஸ் வந்து கீஸ்டோன் மாதிரி என்ஜிஓஸ் வந்து நிறைய என்ஜிஓஸ் வந்து இந்த கோவிட் கிட் வந்து மாஸ்க் அந்த சானிடைசர் அதெல்லாம் நிறைய கொடுத்தாங்க.
To support us during this lockdown, organizations like Keystone Foundation has provided COVID relief kits, masks and such.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prantish. Now let's go Vichitra.
Hello everyone. At the initial state of COVID in 2019 to 2020, none in the community believed about the COVID. Then only when they hit our country and state, people believe the COVID has come. Even then, they were not willing to accept something like this is happening. Awareness campaign conducted by government and NGOs in the community people believe about the COVID and are to clean and neat. Only when the community realize the daily wages, they think they had pandemic problems. So the daily wages work is not possible, which leads to scarcity of food. And also they had the support received from the government and NGOs. NGOs like Keystone Foundation, they distribute food relief kit and food kits. Since we are not able to go out, the community people went to practice old practice, went to forest and collect food. The food, they thought the food is medicine for COVID. It is very difficult to accept the community people to accept that they had to take vaccine, and many awareness program conducted. Finally, they accept to take vaccine through the vaccination drive conducted by district administration and NGOs like Keystone Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vichitra. That was very nice. Before I'll hand this over to Neema for sharing by Cole and Laura, their perspectives. But just to put a question out there for people to reflect, when we come to the question answer and a discussion session, is there are things to learn between these two landscapes from India and the US, especially in the context of pandemic, especially in the context of how local communities have been managing and coping this. You heard from all the three of them that they went back in many ways to the basics. They went back to local livelihoods, went back to medicinal plants. They tried to dig up old cultural moorings and cultural truths, which saved them, where food was considered to be medicine. So there are things which we need to learn from. How do these communities coped there, and how? Let's hear from Cole and Laura, the perspective from the US. Neema?
Pratim, before that, there were these images of what happened in the Nilgiris. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes. So we had this major relief operation and relief things that we did since last year, from 2020, and also this year. A lot of people were involved. And this hall where we are sitting, which is Mandare, which is the pictures at the back, This is the Adivasi Resource Center, and this was converted completely into a relief emergency operations center. So what you see in the pictures are vegetables being distributed to the communities, and they have actually made it to small parcels so that each and every family gets a regular thing. Next slide. This is the relief given by Keystone Foundation to the communities out in the villages. That's Chandran from the vehicle. He is one of our senior persons in the organization. So in the kit, we had several things. We had rice, we had oil, we had sometimes dried fish, we had nutrition packets, all the different kinds of things that we had. Next, please. This is again another shot of people who have visited Nilgiris and been with us. You can spot probably Janma, who is one of the real leaders of the time from everybody, from all us. So this was absolutely a regular thing to keep going to the villages, and this effort and action is still going on within the community. Next. This is another picture of the relief that's happening. And so what we did is, apart from food relief and emergency provisions, we also went into a lot of sanitary things. Like masks and many things connected to COVID and what people generally need in an emergency. This was a very interesting initiative that sprung up quite naturally. It's in one of the slum areas that we work. People this idea that can we go ahead, and she taught the local communities there, and they started making masks, and these masks went around everywhere. So these are small initiatives which really helped in the managing and handling the COVID pandemic.
Thank you, Pratim.
Yes.
And you know, like Pratim was saying, we were in touch throughout the pandemic and talking about, you know, under lockdown, both in India and here, and talking about how there are these ties of solidarity and how one really thinks through surviving in each place with very different kinds of challenges. And what was so heartening for us, which is, you know, I'm going to turn it over to Cole and Laura, is to talk about the kinds of things they were thinking about in terms of their relationship to the Nilgiris and what that meant. And so, you know, these are images from another project that we were running to think about the kinds of ways in which people who are connected in different parts of the world were trying to survive the pandemic. And so I am going to turn it over to Cole, who was, you know, studied in the forest, you know, he was studying the Forest Rights Act when he was in India, and he now works on affordable housing, but he was so instrumental to one of the responses from the Cornell students, the alumni of the NFLC, with, you know, their community partners back there. So Cole, over to you.
Thank you. So it is so interesting to hear these observations. They are to a lot of the things that we have seen unfold here in the US as well. So just to name a few, based on what I just heard, the disruption to education, especially for the youngest children who cannot learn online, issues with mental health becoming more prominent in daily life, issues with food supply or needing, and also, of course, vaccine hesitancy among different social groups, which we continue to confront here in the US. So just to kind of provide a little bit of context from Where Laura and I are coming from in our experience with the NFLC, we were both members of the first batch of the NFLC, which started in 2015, spring semester. And at that time, there were 7 Cornell students and 5 Keystone students. And so this was a very immersive semester that was centered on a deep exchange of culture and knowledge, which spanned topics of environmental governance, Indigenous livelihoods, and community health. And so Neema just mentioned that specifically the project I was working on was on the Forest Rights Act. And since that time, we've seen 5 different batches of students participating either in new projects or continuing the projects that we started back in 2015 and carrying on this exchange over time. So I think that the impact that that experience had that I've carried with me since that time, when I think about how we cope with COVID from individual, family, and community perspectives, the NFLC really expanded our sense of community to a global scale. Because it wasn't a typical experience studying abroad for a US student. It was this deep exchange that was really focused on slow learning and deep learning and personal relationships. And I remember that before we traveled to India, Neema had us reflect on what how we would describe our worldview. And so I think the impact of this experience was that our worldviews were expanded in such a way that when we confront a major challenge like the COVID pandemic, we are not just viewing it through our own personal lenses, but we're also able to put on these other lenses of the partners and communities that we were embedded with in India. And so I think it was that sense of shared responsibility and solidarity, to use the word that we've already brought up, that I think made it so we could not ignore the impact that we were seeing COVID have on India specifically, and then wanting to help out and raise funds toward that end.
Thank you so much, Cole. Laura?
Thank you. I very much agree with everything that Cole just shared, both in terms of expanding our worldview to sort of think outside of our immediate local communities here to really think about our family over in Keystone. One thing that really struck me that you were all sharing was this idea of COVID forced us to go back to basics. I feel like that was true too for a lot of the US experience. I think that there were similar issues with food security that folks face, as Cole mentioned, disruption to education, disruption to jobs and wages. But one thing too that really came out of it in this back to basics was the importance of community and relationships for mental well-being. And so I know that that was something that early on our NFLC batch, many of whom are still some of my closest friends, we were chatting and really our hearts were just going out to our Keystone community and the community in the Nilgiris. And so that was, Cole had the idea to raise funds. And that just sort of was a natural response to something like this happening, was that initial, well, what about our other people in our community? How can we support them? So I think the COVID really forced folks to reevaluate what matters, forcing folks to slow down and really think about that. And so that was something really powerful, I think, that has stuck with me from my time at the NFLC, is that thinking outside of my community, that is my immediate community, to all the folks that I'm connected with and care about across the globe.
Thank you so much, Laura. And so I was telling Andrew when we were doing the dry run for this recording that hearing Cole and Laura articulate what that experience meant, and hearing Montesh and Jayanti and Visitra also articulate how they've been coping with and dealing with the pandemic, and the communities there have been dealing with it, I think allows Andrew and Pratim and myself and Sarah and Anita and everybody who's been a part of NFLC to really reflect that, maybe there was some piece of it that we're working on to bring our communities together. Maybe some of it is sort of bearing some fruit. So thank you to Cole and Laura, and to Jayanti and Montesh and Visitra for sharing your experiences. At this point, I think, Pratim, we'll turn it over for a
Yes.
Q&A. Yeah.
Yes. Am I muted? No. Wilfred?
We can hear you.
Okay, sorry. We can open up the floor for any questions from anybody out there to any of the participants or any of us. We'd love to share and answer.
Just chat.
Yeah, just chat. Yeah. It's a conversation. Yeah.
Conversation. There's Laura in Mandare, the other side from where Pratim is standing.
Yeah. Looks like it's a silent morning.
Andrew's got a question. Andrew has a question. Andrew.
Yes, Andrew.
Not a question, but
comment.
A comment, maybe observation. And, this idea of getting back to basics and finding sources of resilience within the known when facing the unknown is so important for a sense of well-being. I was part of a research project looking at Irula communities in Chingalput district near Chennai. And I was looking at narratives that had been collected, video interviews. So I wasn't there, obviously, but I was reading these stories. And this ended up in a big report that was sent to the WHO on the impact of COVID. But one thing that is very clear that I heard in these accounts was the sort of structural violence, or the ways in which those who are already vulnerable were made so much more vulnerable when labor schemes like Manrega, the 100 Days Work scheme, were suspended, when markets were closed, when people really were struggling just to make ends meet, and how that in turn impacted their mental well-being and the stress that in some cases led to homelessness in that urban context. But I also heard a lot of stories about people going to their source and root of personal and spiritual strength through Irula culture and through Irula spiritual beliefs and reciprocity with one's neighbor and caring for one another. So I was actually quite amazed at the resilience of the human spirit, which is everywhere in the world. We're hearing stories like this, but they had this very distinct Irula, not your Nilgiris Irula, but the sense of solidarity, of looking after one another, and the sense of responsibility in the community that we really have to look after one another because we are all in this together. So both the kind of sort of brute aspect of inequality and poverty that really impacted certain individuals more than others. And lots of stories about families huddled around a single phone trying to do lesson plans through WhatsApp because they couldn't get good receptivity to do Zoom for schooling and things like that I would hear about. But on the other hand, the sense of really bonding together and turning to sources of faith and resilience through religion, through traditional cultural practices, and also, as you said, through going back to cultivation and food security issues. So just another case, but it seems to resonate so much with what all of you have spoken to so eloquently and beautifully.
I have a question for the folks in Mandare and for Cole as well, just really all of us thinking about in this going back to basics, there's been a return to some practices that folks may not have been doing prior to the pandemic. Do you think, ideally, knock on wood, in the future past the pandemic, what of these do you think will continue? And what do you think will stop again?
You want to translate it? Yeah.
அவங்க என்ன கேக்குறாங்கன்னா இப்போ நம்ம லாக்டவுன் சமயத்துல திரும்ப பாரம்பரிய முறைகளுக்கு நம்ம போயிருக்கோம். ஆனா இப்ப திரும்ப எல்லாம் ஓப்பன் ஆகிற சமயத்துல எந்த அளவுக்கு எதெல்லாம் நீங்க இருக்கும்னு நினைக்கிறீங்க, எதெல்லாம் அப்படியே நின்னு போய்டும் நினைக்கிறீங்க?
50% of agriculture.
Slightly louder.
50% of agriculture continues ஆகும். Depends on the economic depends பண்ணி அது continue ஆகும்.
Okay. Jayanti says agriculture 50% of it would sustain, but it depends on the economic support that they might receive.
என்ன நடக்கும், என்ன ஸ்டாப்போம்? சொல்ல முடியும்.
சொல்லுங்க.
சில்ட்ரன்ஸ் வந்து கண்டிப்பா இப்போ அந்த லாக்டவுன் டைம்ல வந்துட்டு அவங்க ஃபாரஸ்ட்ல போயிட்டு வந்தாங்க. இதுக்கப்புறமும் வந்துட்டு அவங்க கண்டிப்பா போவாங்கன்னு நான் நினைக்கிறேன். எஜுகேஷனும் வந்து கண்டினியூ ஆகும்.
ஓகே.
நம்ம கலாச்சாரமும் பாதுகாப்பா இருக்கும், அதே மாதிரி எஜுகேஷனும் இருக்கும்.
ஓகே. Visitra has seen children going to the forest to collect wild food during this pandemic, and she feels that this practice would continue, which would also sustain their culture. And also education would also keep continuing.
That's quite remarkable at one level.
What about Cole and Laura from your side? When you look at the youngsters in the US, your age group, what are they saying? How are they coping, or are they wanting to think that this is just a bad dream and it's going to probably go away and it'll never come back? What are they saying? What are they thinking?
I can start. I think initially there might have been some of that bad dream thinking where this is something temporary and it's going to go away. But now, a year and a half into this, I think folks are recognizing that in a lot of ways this may be the new normal. And so professionally in the working world, you're seeing dramatic changes in the fact that a lot of companies are now just committed to being virtual moving forward. And right now, a lot of communities are having in-person school again with different quarantine plans in place. And it's in the US, schools start in August typically. And then, we're 1 month into schools and there's already, thousands of students being quarantined. And so it's this balance between folks are trying to return to normal in some ways, but that is putting some of the most vulnerable folks at risk, their families, and then also teachers are really at risk from all these students going back to school. So I think we're moving out of the hopeful that this is all just going to go away, I think, into recognizing this is the new reality. And I feel for children who are so young that they don't really remember a world before COVID. We're also seeing a lot of kids are really good with technology now, because that's kind of how they're most familiar with school at this point. So those are sort of my thoughts on it. Cole, I'm curious what you think as well.
Yeah, I don't have so much to add. It's just an observation about how it's coming. It's very apparent to me how powerful the story of what we're telling about what's happening is and how that impacts our behavior. So earlier on, when we were telling the story of, there's this new threat and we all have to lock everything down and change the way we live. And even though that threat is still here, the story has changed, at least from my observation in daily life, to a place where we're saying, it's not the threat isn't as bad anymore. We can go back to living our lives. We can do away with these practices that we had to adopt to deal with the situation, even though the threat is still there. And so I think it just makes me think about how the power of that narrative really keeps influencing our decisions and how we perceive the threat, even though the facts haven't changed that much, or at least in the US, we are still far from eradicating the disease, right?
Interesting, very interesting. We have a question from Deepa from Hong Kong. Hi, Deepa. She asks, what is the situation on the ground in the community with regard to school-going children?
Deepa கேட்டிருக்காங்க, இப்போ இருக்கிற சூழ்நிலையில, இப்போ பிரசன்ட் சிச்சுவேஷன்ல ஸ்கூலுக்கு போற பசங்களுடைய நிலைமை எப்படி இருக்கு?
அவங்களுடைய கிளாஸ்ல என்ன சொல்லி கொடுப்பாங்க அது டோட்டலா ஏன்னா அந்த டச்சே இல்லை. ஸ்கூலுக்கும் அந்த குழந்தைங்களுக்கு இருக்கிற டச் இப்போ ரொம்பவே விட்டு போயிடுச்சு. அண்ட் அது இல்லாம அந்த ஸ்கூலுக்கு நம்ம போகணும் போகக்கூடாது அந்த மாதிரி ஒரு ஐடியா கூட பசங்க கிட்ட இல்லை. நான் எப்பவும் இப்போ விளையாடிட்டே இருக்காங்க, அவங்க அக்ரிகல்ச்சர் லேண்டுக்கு போய் அந்த ப்ராக்டிஸிங் இருக்கு. ஸோ அந்த ஸ்கூல் பத்தின ஒரு கனெக்ஷனே இல்லாத ஒரு சிச்சுவேஷன் தான் இப்போ இருக்கு.
Jayanti says that the children have forgotten about studies. They have lost touch with education and they are still not clear about how to go to school or whether they should go to school because they have been more involved with playing and agriculture practices. So this has created confusion among children to how to go forward with education.
And some point, சில சமயங்கள்ல இந்த ஆன்லைன் கிளாஸ் இருக்கு, சில ஸ்கூல்ஸ்ல கொடுக்குறாங்க. ஆனா அதை அட்டென்ட் பண்றதுக்கான இன்டர்நெட் வசதி எதுவும் இல்லை. அது இல்லாம இப்போ நமக்கு நிறைய மொபைல்ல தான் நம்ம கொடுக்கறதால அந்த மாதிரி போன்ஸ் கிடைக்கிறதுல கூட குழந்தைங்களுக்கு நிறைய பிரச்சனை இருக்கு.
Since most of the classes are through online virtual medium now, and internet of course is a problem in their areas. Also access to phones, they do not have mobile phones to be part of these online classes.
So I think this urban-rural divide that we have in India is only going to increase, isn't it? Because throughout this pandemic, I have been working very closely with the school in New Delhi, which is obviously a privileged school. And they have gone entirely online, and they've had like classes have been going on as usual, even though it's all online. And the school has tried to replicate what actual in-school experience is online. But I think for the rural children, it's going to be very different.
அவங்க என்ன சொல்றாங்கன்னா, அவங்க டெல்லியில க்ளோஸா ஒர்க் பண்ணிட்டு இருந்தாங்க ஸ்கூல்ஸோட இந்த லாக்டவுன் சமயத்துல. அப்போ அங்க இருக்கிற ஸ்கூல்ஸ்ல வந்து வர்ச்சுவல் ஆன்லைன் கிளாஸஸ் வந்து ஒரு பெரிய வித்தியாசமா தெரியல. ஸ்கூல்ல இருக்கிற மாதிரி அவங்களால ரீக்ரியேட் பண்ண முடிஞ்சிருக்கு ஆன்லைன் கிளாஸஸ்ல. அப்ப அவங்க என்ன நினைக்கிறாங்கன்னா, இந்த சிட்டிக்கும் நம்ம ரூரல் ஏரியாஸ்க்கும் இருக்கிற பிரிவு அதிகமா ஆக்கிட்டு தான் போகுது இந்த லாக்டவுன் சமயத்துல நம்ம நினைக்கிறாங்க.
இன்னொரு பாயிண்ட் என்னக்கா, இப்போ லாக்டவுன் டைம்ல வந்து இந்த வைரஸ் வரும்போது தேர்ட் ஸ்டாண்டர்ட் ஃபோர்த் ஸ்டாண்டர்ட் படித்தவங்க கூட பரவாயில்ல, இப்போ அது கொஞ்சம் ஞாபகம் இருக்கும். அவங்க கிளாஸ் அட்டன் பண்ணுறாங்க, ஆன்லைன் கிளாஸ் அட்டன் பண்ணுறாங்க. ஸோ அந்த 2019 வந்து இப்போ ஸ்கூல் ஜாயின் பண்ணுன்றவங்களுக்கு அந்த வைரஸ் வந்து ஸ்கூல் ஓப்பன் ஆக போனதுனால அவங்களுக்கு வந்து இப்போ 2-3 இயர்ஸ் ஆகிப்போச்சு. அவங்க தேர்ட் ஸ்டாண்டர்ட் படிக்க வயசு வந்துருச்சு. ஆனால் அவங்களுக்கு வந்து எதுவுமே தெரியாமல் இருக்கு. அந்த அவங்க பேரண்ட்ஸ் படிச்சிருந்தா கூட அவங்க கொஞ்சம் ஏதோ சொல்லிக் கொடுப்பாங்க. ஆனால் அவங்க பேரண்ட்ஸ் படிக்காதவங்க நிறைய பேர் இருப்பாங்க. இப்போ 50% பேரண்ட்ஸ் படிக்காதவங்க தான் இருப்பாங்க. ஸோ அப்படி இருக்கிறவங்க வந்து அந்த குழந்தைக்கு வந்து இப்போ 7 years ஏஜ் அவங்க வந்ததுக்கு அப்புறமும் ஒன்றும் தெரியாம இருக்கு.
So what Montesh tells is students who are in primary school have completely forgotten what they were learning, and he has seen that kids who are in the age to join schools have not been able to admit them in the schools, and the parents are also not educated. So this has created a gap in them being admitted in schools and them to even get this education. And he has seen children close to 7 years of age who's not been going to schools at all and not been given any form of training.
Chitra, yes. கொஞ்சம் சத்தம் பேசுங்க.
அவங்க வந்துட்டு இப்போ வீட்லயே இருக்கிறதுனால அவங்க லாங்குவேஜ் வந்துட்டு நம்ம கம்யூனிட்டி லாங்குவேஜ் மட்டும்தான் பேசுவாங்க. அவங்க கத்துக்கிற வேண்டிய லாங்குவேஜ் வந்துட்டு அவங்க மறந்துடுறாங்க, அவங்க கத்துக்கவும் முடியாம போயிடுது. இப்போ வெளியில வரும்போது அவங்களுக்கு வந்து ஒருத்தருக்கு ஒருத்தர் பேசிக்கும்போது ரொம்ப கஷ்டமா இருக்கு. நம்ம லாங்குவேஜ்லயே பேசிட்டு அவுட் சைட் வரும்போது தமிழ் இங்கிலீஷ்னு போகும்போது ரொம்ப கஷ்டமா இருக்கு.
Children staying in their villages during this lockdown have been communicating mostly in their own indigenous languages. And this has created difficulty in them to move out. And when they come out of the villages, conversing in English or in Tamil, or even understanding Tamil has become a problem.
How do you think this can be, this situation can be amended post the pandemic, or now that there is awareness that this is happening? What are the ways in which this can be maybe made better? It's just a question, because I think unless we think about it, we won't be able to do anything.
இப்போ இந்த மாதிரி நடக்குதுன்னு நம்ம சமுதாயத்துல பார்த்துட்டு இருக்கோம். இதுக்கெல்லாம் நம்ம என்ன பண்ண போறோம் நம்ம யோசிச்சிருக்கோமா? இது உங்க ஜஸ்ட் ஒரு கேள்வியா கேட்கறாங்க. நம்ம யோசிச்சிருக்கோமா இதை பத்தி?
ஒரு விஷயம் யோசிக்கிறேன் என்னன்னா, பேசிக்கா அந்த ஸ்கூல்ல என்ன சப்ஜெக்ட் கொடுக்குறாங்க அப்படி நம்ம குழந்தைங்களுக்கு சொல்லி கொடுக்க முடியாம போனாலும் ஓரளவுக்கு அந்த கம்யூனிட்டிலேயே ஒரு 12th ஸ்டாண்டர்ட் அப்படி போயிருக்கிறவங்க கிட்ட அவங்க கொஞ்சம் கிளாஸ் பேசிக் இங்கிலீஷ் தமிழ் அந்த மாதிரி பேசிக் சொல்லி கொடுக்க முடியும், மேத்ஸ் அந்த மாதிரி. ஸோ அது கொஞ்சம் அந்த ஸ்டடியோட டச் இருக்கிற மாதிரி அங்க இருக்கணும்.
What Jayanti feels is, even though we can't have subject knowledge, we have people who are finished class 12 or high school in our villages, higher studies, whoever is educated in our villages can take responsibility to teach our children the basics in English or maths or whatever that they can help our children with.
So maybe this needs to be done in a structured way. I mean,
இது இன்னும் கரெக்டா பண்ணணும் அப்படின்னு. Yes.
Yeah. But sorry, Deepa, you're absolutely right that in India especially, there has been a study by UN also recently, where almost 42% of children and youth, they say, have lost cognitive skills and have really lost out on basic understanding because of this entire gap due to COVID. So the school going activity, what we have normal schools, that activity is missing. So whatever, like you mentioned, the rich people have continued with this online thing and they become much more technological savvy. But the rural folks, the urban poor, the rural poor, the tribal people, for a lot of them, this has been a big bridge to break. It's a big gap to bridge, really. That we are seeing more and more in the communities. Neema, you wanted to say something.
No, I'm just listening and I'm thinking, I mean, everybody's raised this, right? And everybody's talked about how the pandemic, I mean, at one level, like Andrew spoke about, like Cole and Laura, and what we spoke about earlier was about the ways in which we're trying to keep connections going back to ideas about like what keeps us going, right? The relationships we hold and we maintain. And at another level, I mean, I'm listening to everybody speak, and the divides between communities of the haves and the have-nots has just become so much wider, so much deeper. And I do think it requires very sustained thinking to the gaps were always very large and now they're even become larger. And what does that mean? And how do we start to think about it? And and can the NFLC in its next iteration, if we have students coming next spring, can we really think about what it means to be coming together to build those kinds of relationships that Cole and Laura suggest, and everybody here, right? Jayanti and everyone is talking about, but to think about what it is, we keep talking about community expressed need, and that the NFLC as a pedagogical model must be about community expressed need. And so how does one start to think about that? How does one start to really, not just process what is happening with the pandemic and think about the good pieces? Like, I mean, I love the way Visitra talked about how children are learning again about the forest, but then also to think about the losses, right? To think about how one responds to that. An entire year of education just gone.
I can
And
share.
honestly, I mean, what Deepa said about sort of the wealthy, I mean, look at Cornell, right? We've continued, our students haven't lost a day of education. We pivoted in terms of technology and what we are using. So the haves have managed to ride the pandemic. Anita, you were going to say something.
Anita, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting. So I agree. And education has definitely, this kind of literacy has probably taken a back seat. But the pandemic has provided the opportunity for other kinds of knowledge to sort of flourish. That's one of the things. And thanks to the NFLC, this whole lens on waste management, which opened up, at least for me, that. And when I look at, there's so much more inputs from the panchayat to keep the district, the roads maintained, the garbage systems. Like I see the sanitary workers having gloves and jackets, things that I hadn't seen before. So the pandemic has also brought in a sort of level of awareness. And I don't know if this will last beyond the pandemic. So that would be something. And I also wonder for communities, has this meant that the public health system has reached out more? Has this, because of the nature of the pandemic and the need for vaccination, have the ASHA workers increased their frequency? So on the other side, there have been mechanisms that have also kickstarted, improved, gotten better. At this time, I don't know if they will last beyond the pandemic. Just wanted to put that comment in there.
Yeah.
Very, very valid and interesting point. There's a question from Andrew. It says that it appears from the NGOs are playing a huge role in providing relief and essential services at the grassroots level in India. I wonder how public-private partnership will be impacted by the pandemic.
I think the question was just raised by Anita in terms of, what will the new commitments be in public health, both internationally, in terms of, member state contributions to building a more resilient public health global system, as opposed to, specific targeted malaria, AIDS, pandemics, targeting, with vaccines, et cetera. But the sort of general resilience systems have been poorly funded. And we've seen the rise of more public-private partnerships in public health, where the Gates Foundation has sort of assumed the big role, or maybe Bloomberg and other private funders. And I just don't think, without a large public commitment of member states giving money, the resilience will be there to meet the need. Otherwise, it's going to just worsen the have and have not situation.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious from the Indian side, if the Indian government has the capacity to expand public health, or whether it's relying specifically on Keystone, and in my case, the Banyan in Chennai, or other NGOs around the country that are doing extensive health-related work or community development work. And, how strapped is the government because of the financial hit that has hit every country, frankly.
A comment I can make, a response from what I see in the district or also in our state of Tamil Nadu and across the country. One is I see that because they've lost on the economy in the last 1.5, almost going to be 2 years in March, all governments are really putting a lot of resources back into industrialization in a very, very big way. So which means coal-fired projects, which means a lot of extractive stuff that was not there so much is coming back onto the picture, especially for India. I see that in Tamil Nadu in a big way. Every day we are seeing more and more MOUs being signed and more industries being developed. That's one. Definitely the allocation to health and pandemic and COVID and all these things have gone up. More and more organizations, individuals, NGOs like us and everybody else, everybody has chipped in, and the district administration has been extremely open to working with us, to be able to partner with us to set up things. We recently set up an oxygen plant in the Kotagiri Government Hospital with funding from the HCL Foundation. So the collector, the district administration, they're really, really working very closely to be able to say each and every help now counts. So we have a WhatsApp group amongst all the NGOs and the district administration on a tribal vaccination drive. So last night we had an emergency thing that all NGOs should again put in their efforts to make sure that the third wave and the next round of vaccination is covered completely. So these kind of conversations and these kind of quick partnerships and responses, you never saw it before from the government. So that has changed this, definitely. But what is worrying is we seem to be now catching up on lost time because of the economy loss. And and COVID is, Laura says it's like a new normal. So people will live with it. There'll be deaths. There are deaths from malaria and other epidemics. This is another one. But a lot of the thing I feel is a business as usual is happening in a much, much more strong and reinforced way, unfortunately. Yes, Deepa?
Pratim, I lived in Tamil Nadu. I lived in Chennai for 25 years before I moved to Mumbai and then to Hong Kong. And compared to the other states, in our more Bimaru states, as they were referred to earlier, Tamil Nadu was in the forefront of public health care in the country. So I think what you're speaking is a very positive scenario from Tamil Nadu. What about the other states? I mean, this is just a very general question. Do you have any awareness or knowledge of that, or?
No, definitely the other states compared to Tamil Nadu, they don't have this kind of a health infrastructure or a health delivery system. So when I hear what Sneh says about what's happening in the rest of the country through her networks, the situation is extremely bad. That especially the migrant situations and many things there, you cannot compare it to the TN health systems. Yeah. Shall we take any last round of questions, because we are 1 hour up and we should move on. You guys have a good evening and we'll go and catch up on some breakfast. And thank you so much for attending. I see 11 of us in the group. It's like a football team, and that's good. And we hope to have every month, the Nilgiris Foundation wants to come out with a webinar, and we will circulate the next one. And we want to always have a link with the US and always have a link with NFLC and Cornell, so that we can take these stories and spread these stories and have these very interesting conversations. I want to thank Neema, Cole, Laura, Vichitra, Montish, Lakshmi, Jayanti, Sara, and everybody around in the team to have made this possible. Thanks a lot. Have a great weekend and catch up with you all soon. Take care. Remain safe. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.